So a Buddhist monk and an English teacher read a BookTube darling, and well, the results are mixed. Welcome to the next episode of I'm Lecton from Reading from the Depths, and I'm joined by Carl from Please Read Your Book, and we are reading Stoner by John Williams. So we've gotten about halfway through. We did an introduction video last week saying why we were interested in doing this buddy read together and chronicling it. And now that we're about halfway through, Carl, how are you feeling?
I'm not liking it. I guess I'll just say it right there. So if you're looking for a discussion about how I love this book so much, you're going to be disappointed.
Yeah.
I suddenly, because I think I had told you before, I tried to read this over the summer and I stopped after chapter 4. Mm-hmm. And for all the same reasons that I stopped, I've again compelled to just not finish reading the book. So
really,
yeah, I mean, I'll definitely finish it because we're halfway there, and it's not a long book. It's not a difficult read. It's just kind of a why. I just kind of find myself asking why. My biggest problem is just Stoner, just the character of Stoner, and that's really problematic because the whole book is really just like his life. It's almost like a biography. You know?
Yeah. I'll say I'm a little more on the fence than you. I'm really enjoying the writing, and there are brief moments that I think are really fun in Stoner's life. But I agree, like Stoner as a character, I just haven't latched onto him yet, and that's fine. I don't have to like the main character of a story. But as you said, if the book is all about the a slice of life of a certain character, then you have to be attracted to something about that character, whether you like him or you dislike him. And I'm kind of neither, But there are moments of extreme frustration and moments of oh, okay, that's an interesting thing. And the writing itself is kind of pulling me along. So I'm enjoying the process. If I wasn't doing a buddy read, I would still finish the book. I'm unhappy with the book, but I am not feeling the excitement that BookTube seems to offer for the book. So we're, I think, a little less unhappy with it than you, but also not overly enthused. So maybe I thought maybe we can just go through in somewhat chronological order, or if anything pops up, and just see where it goes. I think him getting to the university and then becoming obsessed with literature. At first, when I thought about it, I thought it's so unexpected, right? What is the opportunity in your life when you read one thing or hear one thing? And in his case, it was a kind of persnickety professor reciting Shakespeare, where it just changes your life, right? And it makes him speechless. And I was like, that just seems, and we were talking last time about how he isn't an average person at all, and so much of his life seems much, outside of average. So my first reaction was, that just seems convenient, right? But then I was thinking about it, and actually a very similar thing happened in my life. Not with literature, but when I started college, so the same age as him. Well, I guess he started a little bit late, but when I was 18 and I was a freshman in college, at that point, I had grown up in a nominally Christian household, and at that point, I knew I wasn't Christian, and I was a very angry, cynical 18-year-old who was convinced that all religion was designed to harm people. So I was interested in studying religion to prove how wrong it was. That was literally my motivation when I went to university. But at the same time, right before I started university, a very good friend of mine had died, and his husband asked me to read something at his funeral, and it was a huge funeral service. There was, I think, 150 singers, 500 people in attendance. It was a memorial service, not a funeral service. And when I got up at the lectern to read, it was a bit of a letter I had written him when he got sick. I realized if I opened my mouth to read anything, I was going to burst into tears because I didn't have any emotional language to navigate the grief I was feeling. So when I got to college, I was very angry at religion and cynical, but also missing something in my life. And I didn't know what it was. And then I took a class on Intro to Buddhism, and I felt like I had come home to something I had never known I left. And it wasn't as kind of instantaneous as Stoner's experience with reading English literature, but over the course of that semester, something made sense to me in a way it had never made sense before. So to some extent, I actually do have a parallel experience to him, not regarding, I guess regarding my vocation. Ultimately, it did become my vocation, but it wasn't it wasn't the kind of mindless unknowing that he had, but it was parallel. So, you know, at first I was a little bit suspect, but I didn't, in the end, it kind of won me over. And I was wondering, what do you think of just the idea of falling into something like so immediately and like not being ready to fall into it, especially in academia or in literature or in whatever your calling or vocation might be? You think that's like a realistic?
I do think it's realistic. Actually, I want to talk about this. Yeah, I do think it's realistic, and I think it's an important, or it can be a very important thing to try to express in writing or in any kind of art, really, that people do kind of find their way, not always when they're looking for it, you know, and I think that is a lot more common, but that's one of the things I find so frustrating about the novel is it's something that it just happens. And then there's no sort of like, it just happens to him.
Yeah, I agree.
We don't really feel him or understand this change or this spark that happens within him. It's just kind of another thing. It's just like, and that's kind of my biggest frustration. He's almost like Forrest Gump, where like he's the world and everything's happening around him, and he's not aware that he's a part of what's happening. You know, and
I mean, there are a few moments. I feel the same way for most of his life, and it's the same with him deciding to, you know, enroll in the PhD program. Never mind, just get a master's, but then to enroll in the PhD program, and then to even become a teacher. Like when Sloan tells him that you're going to become a teacher, and he's like, what do you mean? And he's like, you're going to become a teacher because you love this. Like, this is what you are in love with. And then he couldn't say anything because he realized, oh, you're right. So I agree. It's like so much from the outside, but then there are a few scenes, especially as he gets into his teaching. At first, his teaching is not quite good, but there are moments when he is actively pursuing things, and they are few and far between. I made a note of like the first time it seems like he's making any active decision. And the first time is when he goes to knock on Edith's door. Like that's the first time it seems like he actually is being proactive in something. And it happens to be something that maybe is a little bit destructive in the end. But it even says, deliberately, as if committing himself to something, he stepped forward and walked down the path to the porch and knocked on the front door. That was really the first time that I was like, okay, he's doing something, you know? And later, once he starts teaching, especially when what's interesting is when Edith is away, is when he starts teaching more, and he starts falling in love with teaching, right? He doesn't really fall in love with it until she disappears. I mean, we'll get to that when we get to that whole section. But that is when I feel like he is his most active and not passive, is when he is outside of the whatever burden he has created for himself in that relationship, which I don't think is her. I think it's the way he's created that relationship.
That relationship is really weird. It's like he kind of just like, she's the first girl that catches his eye, and then suddenly it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess we're a couple now and we're going to get married. And, you know, it was just, again, one of those like things where it's just sort of happening to him.
You know, I mean, in many ways, it felt like it reflected his experience of switching to English literature. Is just that he has a moment where he's overwhelmed, and he's so unused to, like, coming from the farm, right? And coming from a very simple life where he didn't expect anything. And then once he sees something or experiences something that overwhelms what he expects, his expectations, then he can't, he like fascinates on it. And so that's what happened with literature. And with her, very similar, you know? So once like he wasn't expecting that, and all of a sudden his world changed. And instead of like analyzing it in any smart way, he just like decided this was the only way to go forward. And, you know, to some extent, like that makes sense. Like the inability for any sort of inner reflection. Like if you look at his father, I thought there was like really beautiful world building in the beginning when his father tells him to go to university, right? And his father says, where is it? His father like is here, it's right on page 4 for me. His father, when he says like, you know, if I go to university, will you and mom be okay on your own and so forth? And his father says, sometimes when I'm working in the field, I get to thinking. He paused. His fingers tightened upon themselves, and his clasped hands dropped to the table. I get to thinking. He scowled at his hands and shook his head. You go on to the university come fall. Your mom and me will manage. Like his complete inability to like express his own ambition, right? The father's, I think really create paints a really interesting and beautiful picture of what Stoner's life was like, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, I mean that's a really, again, that's one of those things though where I felt like the writer John Williams, as there's so much that could be expressed there, and even just through like some symbolism. It doesn't have to be in character's interior monologue. It doesn't have to be omniscient third person telling us what's going on, but there should be some sort of like cue or clue or some flashing red lights or something that, like this is a big moment, you know what I mean? And I guess that's part of what's frustrating me. It's just that I feel like it's just too well honed. It's too well crafted.
Oh, I feel like it's just very subtle. Like, I don't feel like he's imposing anything. Like, I mean, I have heard
that's what I mean, where I feel like he must have edited this down to the point where it is very subtle, and maybe to him, what we think is subtle is quite obvious.
Yeah,
and sometimes it happens with writing that's been workshopped too much or been crafted too much. It's not bad writing, but it's almost too subtle.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, again, I don't know. I appreciate the writing. I appreciate that subtlety, because that's not the kind of thing that needs to matter. You know what I mean? Like, it's just a very small thing that can matter if you want it to. But it does kind of build up. But so in meeting Edith and falling for her paralleled his falling for English literature, and that made sense. And even that first meeting was so awkward. Fine, like, it's the first time meeting a girl, her first time. But then, like, after that, when he continues to court her, it just seems to always go so badly. Like, what in either of their minds was like, this is a good idea? You know what I mean? And from her side, and I jumping ahead a little bit, like, what it seems like Williams was implying is that she was abused as a child by her father, some sort of abuse. You know what I mean?
Something there, something went wrong.
Whether it was sexual or not, I don't know, but there was some sort of overbearing abuse, whether it's emotional neglect or actual abuse, or some sort of something else from her father. And at his death, she has this cathartic moment of, burning all the things that he had ever given her. And she finds herself in a way that she hadn't found herself before then, right? So before then, she is experiencing some sort of PTSD, I think is safe to say. At least that's what Williams is implying. And so I can appreciate from her side, just being like, being this small, meek character who's afraid of the world. And she has finally someone who is a university student who has some sort of prospects teaching, who, isn't like nothing, taking interest in her. So she feels she has to glom onto that. And she even says, like, all she ever says is like, I will be a good wife to you. Not like, I like you, or you're interesting, I want to be with you. No, I will be a good wife. I will do my duty.
Yeah. And side, this is the part of the story where I felt more interested when it's their weird relationship. It
was so sad. I was so depressed the whole time.
It's so horrible, but it's so fascinating at the same time. It's like the slow motion train wreck that you just can't stop watching. And like there's the, like you mentioned, that she, after her father dies and he kills himself, which is quite significant, I think, and quite symbolic. He kills himself right after the stock market crash. And suddenly she like has this like kind of like artistic awakening or something like that, and suddenly she's a teenager. So I think up until that point, she had just been a child, and she just doesn't know what she's doing with her life, and is just kind of similar to Stoner, just kind of bouncing along, and things are just kind of happening, and then she burns all of her father's stuff, and she wants to sort of suddenly rebel against the marriage. And, she's having all these weird issues with the child and stuff like that. I thought that got really interesting, but again, I got frustrated where I felt like, okay, here is the story. Here is the real drama, the actual human drama in the relationship. And there's that, at the same time, he's trying to develop his career. And like, how is this, he's going to have to make some kind of choice, which of course he's Stoner, so he doesn't make choices, but that's, and so how, but that in and of itself is a choice. And so how is that going to play out?
I will say, like, at the beginning part of his marriage, well, first off, at that point, as an audience, we don't realize anything to do with her father, right? We don't know why she is the way she is, just like she's with John. And even any of those suggestions like aren't made clear in the book. Like they aren't explicit. We're just kind of assuming based on the context that he gives us. And I think it's a safe assumption, but it's not made explicit, at least not yet. But so at the beginning of the marriage, when everything is going so awful, I just like my heart was breaking because I was just like a little bit of communication. And I know this was like 1920s, you know what I mean? Like very early 20th century. But like, you know, there was the whole flopper movement. There was like some sort of women's lib going on. Like, you know what I mean? Like there was a space where you could have some independence. And there was just like so closed down, right? Everything was so closed down. And like the saddest thing for me when he was talking about how he still gets, you know, like horny basically. And he like wakes her up at night. And the best times for him was when she would like she would be sleep drugged acquiescence. Because then that let him imagine she wasn't unhappy. Like that is the sad thing, right? Like
that's horrible. I know.
When she lay there like a corpse, he could pretend that she was actually enjoying it. And I was like,
I shouldn't laugh. It's horrible, but it
was so terrible.
Yeah, it's awful. It's genuinely awful.
He makes effort. After that, at least I noticed that he makes more effort. Like he does all these things, right, to try to meet her needs. Like even more so than when he was courting. Like he tries to. I mean, I don't remember exactly, but I have note that like
he's like cleaning the apartment all the time.
He cleans the apartment. He tries to bring her on walks. He tries to do whatever she needs, and he just doesn't have the resources, like the emotional resources, to know what she needs, and nor does she have the resources to explain it. So they're both like, you know, at a standstill that neither of them can overcome at that point. But I appreciate him as a character where he knows this is bad. He's not happy, and she's not happy, and he actually makes effort to try to change it. You know, so that's one thing where I saw him like reaching out of his shell to some extent, and this like passive things happen to me shell where he was like, I am going to try to fix this, and then he fails at it, but that's not really his fault, at least in the beginning of the marriage. Like he makes this effort, which I was impressed with.
And that's what I meant when I said like I felt like, okay, now we're getting some actual narrative, some actual story to work with. But there's just two people that are just so completely out of touch with themselves and also just out of touch with the world around them. Whether some of that's conscious or not, they're just like these major events happen in the world and they just don't seem to have any kind of bearing or impact, you know, on their life. And even as him as a teacher of English and being in the literature department, I was really curious, like, and also frustrated, like he chooses Chaucer, I think for his thesis, or is that his PhD? I can't remember which one it was.
I think is his dissertation, right?
That his dissertation? Okay, so he chooses Chaucer, but why? What is it about Chaucer that... Because a dissertation is a huge undertaking, you know? So you've got to have some drive to do it, you know? And I thought it was like a really pedestrian choice also, especially at this time, because the modernist movement has really blossomed in literature at this time. There's so much great literature that comes out of World War I. And like you said, too, there's social movements. This is suffragette movement. All these things are happening in society. And that stuff is coming through it in the literary world. But he's just like completely closed off to it in this.
Yeah, I mean, even you can see what he enjoys most. I don't know if it was Chaucer, it might have been his master's, the choice here. But he goes back to the Latin and the Greek, like Latin and the Greek, the classics, and how the classics influence the modern. Like that is his drive, right? Is looking to the classics
and specifically grammar.
Yeah,
because there's that sort of like at the beginning of chapter 9 when Walker comes in.
I was gonna say your tone sounds like Walker.
He's giving this like heated speech, like this is supposed to be like, and this is kind of when he's come into his own as a teacher, right? This is where he's kind of passionate. And he's passionate about Latin grammar and how it was much more pervasive than it is in today's contemporary horrible English, you know?
Yeah. Well,
I just thought, and I couldn't help but wonder, like, is Williams kind of trying to portray him as someone who's just out of touch with time and reality? And I was curious about the character of Walker, you know, like, because Walker is this sort of
we'll get
contrarian, fly by the seat of your pants kind of guy who comes in and he needs this course so he can finish within 2 years or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll get to that, but both Walker and Lomax, like, I am not a fan. Like,
Yeah,
I
Lomax too.
did
Yeah.
academia for so long, right? And I know you did as well, since you're a teacher. You had to go through the whole academia thing, and I did 7 years in academia, and I love academia. Actually, the study of religious studies, I really enjoy it. And the only reason I didn't go for a PhD, I had other reasons for not doing it, and then I decided not to go for a PhD before I decided to become a monk. And then once I became a monk, like, everything made sense. But I really like the world of academia and the way you think in academia. But I also have met people in academia, especially considering the universities I've gone to, which were like elite kind of, highbrow universities, very snooty. I met people who they remind me of so much, and they're just so aggravating because they are so full of themselves and like their shit doesn't stink, and they're smart. Like, they deserve to be there, but they also just make everyone else's life miserable. Like, I've met those people, and so I just like go back to my time in university now. It's just like as soon as Lomax showed up, I was like, this is a bad scene. Like, I'm not a fan. And then Walker walked into his office, and I was like, oh. It was interesting to me. I mean, I guess we're jumping around, but like, for Williams to depict the two of them as physically disabled was really strange. Why these two characters who are clearly the most antagonistic? Though I think Finch is also kind of antagonistic. Gordon Finch isn't really a friend. He's like the buffoon who always fails upward, kind of. But why these two were physically disabled, and they're the most antagonistic characters? And it seems like I mean, we stopped at the end of chapter 9, right? So he just had the experience with Walker is where we ended. It seems like that's not that's going to keep going. Like, that's not going to end well for him, is my impression. Or it's going to at least make his life difficult. So why were these two characters disabled?
Well, I think Williams is riffing off of the Southern Gothic concept of the grotesque. Like, have you ever read Flannery O'Connor's short stories? Yeah. So she's always got the antagonist always has some sort of physical disability or something that has pushed them out of society. So they're undesirable. We might think of it nowadays as like an undesirable person, but like the literary term is usually the grotesque, and that person will always stir things up because they've lived outside of society, and somehow they've found their way back in, and they're bringing in all these like unsavory elements that are normally sort of pushed out. And I totally saw that. Walker kind of plants the seed. He kind of opens the door, so to speak. And then I'm sorry, not Walker. Lomax kind of opens the door of that, and then Walker follows in after that. And I wondered too, like if Williams was kind of trying to comment about how there was going to be a sort of clash of worlds between sort of the ivory tower, so to speak, of the university and everyone else, outside. And as higher education becomes more and more accessible in America, those two worlds just are always going to sort of start butting heads. That's kind of
true.
how I thought.
Yeah,
and
I guess
too, because this is after the stock market crash, so there's a lot of people just sort of like, kind of just trying to find their way and scratch by, and that sort of element becomes much more apparent in American society.
So, I mean, I guess I did forget that, like, so much of literature basically before, I mean, in our genres, our preferred genres, horror, crime, and these kind of things, you always have the villain is always has some sort of deformity. Like, it's very common. And a lot of old Stephen King novels, like, the villain is either fat, or he has a limp, or he has a scar, or maybe a combination thereof. Like, it's very common. And it's the kind of thing that we realize now is ableist and not like an appropriate way to create a character. You know what I mean? But I keep forgetting this was written in 1965. So it wouldn't there wouldn't have been any thought of like this being an inappropriate way to, you know what I mean? Like, it wouldn't have the same sensibility as it would for us now. So that, I guess that makes sense. But it is still strange because they're depicted as sympathetic characters, right? Like, they're depicted due to their disabilities as sympathetic. And like, even Lomax specifically calls out, like, you should have some more compassion. Like, think of what he's gone through. Doesn't he earn a little bit extra because of this? Right. when
Right.
the first thing complains about them. So it's not like a shorthand. Like I don't think Williams is doing a shorthand. I think he might be
No,
playing,
no.
as you said, with that Southern Gothic shorthand of the grotesque, but then he's doing something a little more with it.
Yep.
It seems like
Yep.
it's not lazy writing. You know what I mean? Whereas in a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah,
pulp
yeah.
fiction, it is lazy writing instead.
Right.
I will
Yeah.
say, getting back to his teaching, what's interesting is as his marriage is brand new / blowing up at the same time, he starts at least to find joy in his teaching. And what I thought was really interesting, this is in the beginning, before he becomes popular, before he like finds a stride in it, he finds some joy in teaching, but the joy is in the research and in the preparation and in the literature itself. It's not in the teaching and it's not in the students. Right.
Right.
He like wants to be a
Yeah.
perpetual student. He's not interested in the sharing of knowledge. He's just like being in this knowledge, which doesn't have to do with people, with living people, living relationships. That is where he finds joy. And I'm happy for him that he finds some joy, because everything seems to be going pretty awful in his life. I'm glad that he has some joy, but it's not with teaching. It's with the literature itself, you know?
Right. Right. Yeah. 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 It's interesting. So he's, again, still kind of not quite found his place. You know, he's should be someone who's probably just doing research and writing and that kind of thing. Yeah. But instead, he's got to teach to make a living. So
when I was getting my master's of divinity, and there was a student in my Sanskrit class who was working on his 3rd or his 4th PhD, and you're like, "What are you doing?"
Oh my gosh!
You just, he was in his 40s, and he just like finished one PhD and then started another one, and then finished that one and started another one. And you're like, okay, you know what I mean? Like your priorities are very strange, and I feel like Stoner would be that perfect kind of person. You know what I mean? If he didn't ever have to do the thing, at least at this point in his life. Once he becomes better at teaching, and students are interested in what he's doing, and he finds that passion, which he finds when Edith is away because of her father's funeral for 2 months, and he wishes she wouldn't come back, which is like so sad. There's like a moment where he feels bad about wishing she doesn't come back because his relationship with his daughter is going so well and everything's going so good. I thought that was really beautiful. I will say, I know that Williams' writing is really interesting because, as you pointed out, a little bit of your frustration is that like you get to this marriage, which is so wacky and weird and interesting, and he kind of just skips over it, right? Like he skips over these things, but his writing is very fluid. Like he just moves, and like years will pass, a paragraph, and he'll be like, 3 years later, he was still miserable, and you're like, oh, okay, 3 years later now. So it's a really interesting like pace. You know what I mean? Like he just picks out little things and gives you a taste of it, and then he moves on. But in those little tastes, I think there's some writing that I think is really, really exquisite. I really appreciated when Edith was pregnant, and when she was pregnant, she was like bedridden, right? So after the whole wanted to get pregnant situation, that was gnarly. I don't even know what to say about that. Like her deciding she wanted to get pregnant and just becoming like around naked, waiting for him to come home. And that was intense. That whole thing was intense.
Yeah, that was weird. Yeah, that was just like,
as you said though, she's a child, right? So that she has no control of her at that point, because at that point this is before her father dies. So she has no control of her emotions, and she latches on to this possibility of this can be a salvation for her, right? Which is very common. Like a child is going to save this.
That's it. I think that's how it subconsciously. I think that's what was going on with her. Was like she realized like, oh, it's time to have the baby. I'm married now. It's time to have the baby. You know.
It was a very gnarly.
And she doesn't know how to sort of naturally get pregnant. She doesn't know how to naturally make the baby. So she becomes this overacted, sort of exaggerated, supposedly hyper. Suddenly she's hypersexualized, but it's not even, nothing about it is genuine.
Well, there's no pleasure, right? She's not experiencing joy as a result of this. There's no pleasure. There's nothing going on except for like trying to fulfill this need that she doesn't know how to explain, But after she is pregnant and she's bedridden, there's this beautiful, that calms down for a little bit because she basically can't get out of bed. And he comes home from work every day and he makes her dinner and he brings it and he feeds her, and they like sit and talk together. And William says, for a few moments in the evening, then they talked quietly and casually, as if they were old friends or exhausted enemies. Right. I just think that's like really beautiful writing, and it just paints their whole picture of their marriage, old friends or exhausted enemies.
That part really resonated with me, and that's what I meant earlier too, where I said like, okay, I felt like this was actually the interesting part of what I had read so far, and I could really relate to that. I mean, I'm divorced, and there was a point. My divorce was like very long, very protracted. Then there was a point at where we were just like, okay, we're exhausted enemies, so I could kind of relate to that, where everything just kind of finally calms down and you just realize, okay, this is where we are right now. So I agree with that. I thought that was great writing. So I felt like too, I think I might be backing up a bit, but that they have that party.
Nope, that's after.
Oh,
Which
that's
one? The one
after.
with
Okay, yeah.
Finch, which party? The party with Finch and his fiance, or
The
the
one
party
with
with
Finch. Yeah, the one with Finch and
Okay,
his
I think that's
fiance.
earlier. That's earlier,
Yeah,
I
I
think.
thought that was really great writing too, where there's all this weird awkwardness, and then suddenly they seem to have this great relationship, and then the party's over, and it just goes right back to the
Well, no, the party with Finch
shenanigans.
is the one where she locked herself in the room.
Oh, that's where the witch. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. You're right. I got it mixed up with the other party.
But no, but at that time, yeah, but before then, there were other parties that they had that generally she did well at, right? Like there were a number of parties that went well, and he just basically, William says, like, they were unremarkable. Like she put on a face and was able to host the party really well. And then as soon as it was done, she went back to normal, and he cleaned up after the party. But they were unremarkable except for that one with Finch. But then there was the party, the home warming party when they got their house, where she was really, you know, as you're saying, like went out there and got a kiss from Lomax.
Yeah, but there's some really beautiful writing in that at the end of that party with, I think it's one with Lomax. It's in chapter 6, where the party's over, and there's a paragraph there that's really great, where he says, Stoner saw his guests out the front door, lingered a few minutes, watching them descend the steps and walk out of the light from the porch. The cold air settled around him and clung. He breathed deeply, and the sharp coldness invigorated him. And then he goes on, and then he goes back inside the house. Edith's clothes were hung in disarray on the floor beside the bed, the covers of which had been thrown back carelessly. She lay naked and glistening under the light on the white, unwrinkled sheet. Her body was lax and wanton in its naked sprawl, and it's shone like pale gold. So there's this weird, like, all this weird imagery, like just juxtaposing and clashing with each other.
But again,
so she looks so sexy, but she's asleep.
Exactly.
She was fast asleep. In a trick of light, her slightly open mouth seemed to shape the soundless words of passion and love. So it's just like he just has this weird, sad life. But I guess what I want to say though is like that's to me like this section of the book right here is where the writing is really good, the storytelling is really good, and we're starting to finally see this, like, Stoner's life has like these really strangely divergent points, and somehow he's trying to stay in the middle of them all, but they keep diverging, and he's going to have to go one way or the other, you know?
Yeah, well, and the sad thing is, I mean, the choices that he makes that bring him joy then all get taken away from him. Like he had such a good thing going with his daughter, you know, and then his wife and can't see him being happy and let that happen. And so she has to end it, you know? And like, I know a lot, I saw some videos where people said he married the wrong woman and they kind of make her out to be a villain. And like, I agree that she's harming him, but it's hard to paint her as a villain because she clearly went through something, right? As a child. And then like when she came out of it, and now who knows, again, we haven't read the back half of the book, so maybe things changed. But like when she comes out of it, she's a brand new person, but she's married to this person that she clearly doesn't have any interest in. And so of course it feels like, you know, a game of chess all the time for her. So it's hard to paint her as a villain as opposed to them both being like victims of unfortunate circumstances and then not knowing how to get out of it in a meaningful way, you know?
Yeah, I certainly don't see her as a villain. I see her as someone, like you said earlier, with some unresolved trauma, and her difficulties in the relationship are her trying to also kind of work out whatever happened before, whether I was with the father or someone else. But she kind of clearly sees Stoner as the continuation of her father in some way or another person in her life. So.
I go in that same section before that party is when Sloane dies. And again, this is just like, I think how William's writing is, as you said, very, I called it subtle. You called it a little workshop maybe, but there's this, like, he describes Sloane's death when they find him. They say that he is rigidly slumped over his desk. It's such a strange way to describe that, to be rigid and slumped at the same time. Right.
Yeah.
But then that goes on very shortly after that. Stoner is like thinking about Sloane's death, and Stoner like convinces himself that Sloane willed his heart to stop, right?
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
he says, I mean, he doesn't really believe that, but he likes to believe that. And he says, Sloane, he holds the opinion that Sloane willed his heart to stop as a last mute gesture of love and contempt for a world that had betrayed him. So I think Sloane himself has this like all these contradictions within himself. So dying in a slumped, rigid way and having love and contempt for the world, I think that's paralleled really well. And I thought it was just Williams like not making it obvious, like not like, you know, putting a flower on top of it, but just these little things I think are really, really, they suck me into the book. Like that is what part of what keeps me reading along, is because for me, it's a pleasure to read and see these small little things that he does, that even if I'm like, okay, Stoner, you are really boring and you're making bad decisions and you have all these things, make better decisions. Even if that is frustrating to me, it's little artistic, like, I think because the prose is so sparse and like so clean, that these little poetic ideas that get mixed in are really appealing to me. Like they pop out at me in a way, at least the ones I catch.
I like it on that level, and it's very well written on that when you look at it that way. I just feel like I almost feel like it's wasted on this story.
Yeah,
it could be. What I mean? And it's wasted on this kind of like loser character. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about Sloane though. Like, what is going on with Sloane? Like he's almost like upset that the war is over and that Germany has basically lost the war. Did you pick up on that?
He just seems, I mean, obviously at the end of the war, he did seem defeated, right? He became a shell of himself and like stopped doing anything. I don't know if he was,
and he just started
he just seems so
dies.
Right. He's interesting because when we first meet him, he, you know, what I thought was interesting was when we first meet him and he gives that talk. I don't have the page number, but Stoner, or at least Williams, I don't know if it's Williams or Stoner, describes him as like being so full of himself that he knows that his words can never match his intellect, right? Like that's how he's described, as being like that kind of like intellectually astute, that his words can never match it. And it's presented in a grand way. And then when Stoner starts teaching, he has a very parallel experience where all the things in his head, he can't express them the way he feels them, but for him, it makes him feel small. Whereas for Sloane, it made him big, right? So it's interesting.
Sort of like,
same thing has opposite effect. And so Sloane, I feel, is always like that, this contradiction. Because he convinced him basically not to go to the war, but then he was disappointed in him, didn't join the war, you know? Like
it's weird. I couldn't quite figure it out. I couldn't help but wonder though, I guess on one obvious interpretation is that Sloane represents kind of an old guard, and when the war is over, he's not necessary anymore. The world has changed, and you know, that's a point where the world is going to move on, you know? But I think there's must be more to it than that. I feel like that's just a little too obvious. I'm thinking that Stoner kind of is the continuation of Sloane, and that eventually this is just a prediction, but I think eventually Stoner's life is going to start to parallel Sloane's life, because we can see now that Stoner is kind of becoming a more proficient teacher, at least, or a more passionate teacher. And he's not stumbling to articulate himself. And when he meets Sloane has no trouble articulating himself at all. So I can't help but feel like, okay, Stone has kind of picked up that mantle and is carrying it forward. And I'm just curious, like, will he die a similar death? Because we know he's going to die, because that's how the book starts, right? I think that's the very first page. They're talking about
that he dies and
he's passed on, and not many people remember him. So I'm curious to see like how, if Williams describes Stoner's death, will there be similarities, or will there be kind of some echoes of Sloane's passing there? Will there be some kind of world event that happens, and then similar to like World War I and Sloane dies, will there be World War II and then Stoner dies or something like that? So I'm kind of curious to see where that goes.
It's interesting because that relationship with Sloane, it starts out so antagonistic, right? With Sloane just making fun of him basically and calling him out. But then he develops like an affection for Sloane, which Sloane, I guess, somehow like gives back to him to some extent before the end of the war when Sloane like becomes like, so decrepit, but he's still always like aloof. But it seems like Stoner is searching for some sort of acceptance or like some authority figure to give him attention. Like he even comments back in the 3rd chapter that is it in the 3rd chapter? Or maybe even earlier than that, how the university becomes a home for him. Oh yeah, it's in the 3rd chapter. He says he mentions that he feels security and warmth at the university that he didn't even have at home. And for me, that struck me as very lonely, right? Like when so I was just saying, so Sloane in that relationship parallels like a father figure for him, who is always like never giving him the love that he needs, but giving him enough encouragement to keep going forward. And so I don't know, it's just like I see that a lot. I mean, in general, like it makes sense when you have an advisor at university to have like a tight relationship with him. I love my advisor, and like a lot of what I do in my life is because my advisor gave me really good advice, and like I just went back. My friend graduated. A monk I live with was a part of a special program, and he got his master's just last year. So we went to his graduation, and I hadn't seen my advisor in a few years, and it was wonderful to see him again. So like I appreciate that relationship, but still like it just makes me feel that Stoner is so lonely and missing something, and he hasn't figured out how to fill it. And then when he starts getting good at teaching, and people want him, right? When his classes are filled up, then I feel like there's something going on with him, because at that point too, he and his wife had met, like, especially by the end where we are right now, before chapter 9, but I guess in chapter 8 or so, like they've come to a stalemate, and she stopped using their daughter against him and kind of has like stopped being so oppressive regarding the daughter. And he even mentions it's like a stalemate. I don't know I don't remember exact language, but like they've reached some sort of plateau, and he's able to like put himself into the job. So he's ignoring the parts of his life that are harmful, but he is at least focusing on the parts that bring him joy, which I appreciate. And like when he's attracted to teaching, of course, then we get to, well, first, before I get there, I just wanted to say it's interesting how the fathers die and how it's so wildly different, right? Or how Sloane's parent, not Sloane, excuse me, how Stoner's father dies, just like in the middle of the field working, like insisting he has to work, even though he's sick, passing out, and then the wife dying very shortly thereafter out of like basically sadness, heartbreak. And the way he talks about it is like, so like they just returned to the earth that they had worked their whole lives, as if like nothing had happened, which is very poetic, sort of very sad at the same time. But it's very fitting for them because they were so small that like their deaths would be small. But then Edith's father is like such a wheeler and dealer that his death is huge. And not only does he die simply, and not only he doesn't die working, he does the opposite. He dies having cheated a bunch of people. Well, he didn't cheat anyone, but he made bad investments and made aggressive and poor choices. And then he decides to end his own life because he can't see any forward. It's like a big grand statement. Whereas Stoner's parents, there's no statement. This is like the natural part of things. And then they move on, right?
Right. Yeah. That's really interesting because like that's kind of how Stoner is living his life, is that he's just kind of going along with it. Not always so passively, but not also at the same time, he's not also active. Whereas Edith's father, someone who's very active in his life, made tons of choices all the time, good and bad, and makes the choice of when his life will end. Whereas with the parents, that it happened naturally that they died. And and that's again leads back to, I'm curious to see how Stoner's death is. So it'd be interesting to kind of look at all the deaths of these characters and see.
It says something, right, about the way they lived and the way they died. It seems to parallel, at least to some extent. He even says the parents returned to the stubborn earth that they had long given themselves. Or long ago given themselves. So even to say like they returned to the stubborn earth is just like a very like this is what their life was. It was like hardworking. It didn't have a lot of like it didn't. You saw his father tried to make plans for the future and he couldn't express it, right? Like he in the very beginning, like he had thought, like sometimes when they field, I'm thinking, what am I thinking? And he couldn't say it, right? And he had all this hope that Stoner would do the thinking for him, and then Stoner abandoned him, right? Because he found love in something else. That was interesting. I mean, we're almost done here with where we've gone so far, so I won't go back. But when the parents came to his matriculation and he said, I'm staying here to get my PhD, and his father made some statement, I couldn't tell if it was passive aggressive. He's like, fine, then stay. Like, you should stay or something. I was like, is
stay with your books or something like that?
Yeah. is this passive aggressive or is this him actually being supporting? And is there a difference for this person? You know what I mean? I couldn't tell. And it seemed like it was probably later in the book when he returns to his parents. It seems like it had started out as a passive aggressive thing, but then they came to see that this was meaningful for him. And so they changed their minds on it, maybe. But it's just interesting, right?
Yeah. The parents are very like sort of classic, stoic Midwestern, you know, farm people, where I grew up in the Midwest and my grandparents spoke like that, where you couldn't tell, like, was that a cutting remark or was that genuine or was it both, you know? So I think some of it's kind of, that is a kind of a regional thing where people do speak like that, and you do have to sort of like, it's up to you how you want to interpret it, and then that will impact where we go from there. So they're very interesting. And again, that's another like interesting divergence, is that his family and his life so different from Edith's family and Edith's life, you know? And so it's 100%. Just like, so you just know, like, they are just doomed. Like they don't have that commonality that's necessary. It's like opposites do not really attract beyond the first date. You know, it just doesn't really go much further than that. So
getting to, I mean, I will say, so my frustration with Stoner repeatedly is that he like refuses to fight for his own joy. And the moments that he does fight for his own joy, I find really moving. And like, for instance, when he builds his study and he's so meticulous in it, which felt to me like a very typical midlife crisis, though I don't think he's quite midlife at this point. But like, he is like defining himself by this thing that he's doing outside of himself because he doesn't have anything else. Do you know what I mean? So I thought that was really a little sad, but also beautiful, because he created a space for himself that was meaningful. But then when his wife takes it away because, you know, she can't let him win this marriage because at this point in her life, she's decided that it's a competition. He just goes along with it, and he refuses to fight for his joy. And you know, it's so frustrating to me. And I don't want, given this is like taking place at this point, it must be in the late 1920s or so. I'm not quite sure where they are in their marriage, but it'd be around the late 1920s, early 1930s, like give or take in that time period. So you could fall into the stereotypical, the husband just telling the wife what to do, the wife having no agency at all. Like he could fall into that extreme, but instead he's like the opposite extreme. You know, there's no like meeting where he's like, no, this is not working for me. And the only his way of finding happiness is then retreating and going to his office. And so that just like is really sad. Like it's sad and it's frustrating. Again, I'm not frustrated with the book. I'm just frustrated with him as a character, because I'm like, come on, like what, you know, I guess I'm a 21st century person who wants you not to just like accept things that are not working out for you. But there's so many opportunities for him to find joy. And when he does it, it works. But he just doesn't do it enough.
Yeah, I think it's because he just doesn't care enough about the relationship and the marriage. Whereas like when he encounters Walker, he does it and he fails Walker. He takes a stand against Walker. And that's, so there's two things there. I think he sees Walker as a con man, basically, and says, no, you can't be a part of this world. You don't belong here. You didn't put in the work, so to speak. So he fails him. So there are times where Stoner will stand up, and Stoner not necessarily will find his joy, but will at least kind of defend his joy.
But that's because Stoner cares about literature and like the world, studying literature more than he cares about other things. And the fact that you would dare like be a con man in this world, like this thing that's what he loves, right? Like this is what he loves, and you are disgracing it by like not caring about it. And so he's willing to fight something he loves, which is literature and studying. But he's not willing to fight even for his daughter, who he loved and was so meaningful to him. He was like not willing to fight for her. You know, he was just willing to take whatever scraps he could get. Interesting in this chapter, right? And so it's not mentioned in the introduction, but we both know that he has an affair. And I think it's clear that it's going to be with this woman, Catherine, who is his student in this chapter. It's interesting that in this chapter, we meet both like these two pivotal people in Walker and in Catherine at the same time, who both, one is like the source of his anger and one is the source of his attachment. So they're both like firing up these very strong emotions in him, which he's not used to having, because he's used to ignoring his emotions. But it seems like both of those turn out badly for him. And we don't. I don't know I don't know what happens.
Mm.
Because I tried to not listen more than I tried to avoid any spoilers I could. But I can't imagine having the affair is going to be good for his life in general. And Walker seems like he's going to be a giant thorn and a pain in the ass going forward. So like both of these characters, points where he actually does something, like he feels something, and it hurts him. Like he has an emotion, a strong emotion, and it brings him down the wrong path. Which goes into the question with the whole thesis. Maybe he shouldn't be feeling things. Maybe him being numb and passive the whole time is better for him. You know, like
that's why I think this we've
kind of
we've chosen an interesting point to sort of pause or stop reading, because this is where still, like you said, Stoner is confronted where he's had these sort of minor encounters with emotion and turning points in life, and he's always sort of pulled back. But now it's probably reached the point where like he's got to take a stand. And I think, but again, it's like he's taking a stand on one thing because he hasn't taken a stand on something else. He hasn't taken a stand on his marriage. So he has to take a stand on this. Otherwise, otherwise he's not taking a stand on anything. You know what I mean? So
it's the kind of thing, right? Where like it all builds up. Where like if you let yourself be walked upon and like doormat for so long, then you explode. Right? Like you have to find a healthy balance. And so to be fair though, I will say, to be fair, I don't know how he could have dealt with the Walker situation better. Like he went to Lomax in the beginning and Lomax gave him grief right at the top when he tried to. And then even when Walker pulled his stunt at the end, he gave him an out. He's like, I don't have to flunk you. Either I'll give you 3 weeks, I'll give you an incomplete, you can finish it in 3 weeks, or you can give me what you have now and we can work on it together. Like he was being a jerk when he offered him those things because he knew that Lomax was lying. Excuse me, and Walker was lying. Like he knew that, but he still was giving him an out, right? He wasn't like immediately dropping the hammer. He's like, there are ways out. And then when Walker refused to take whatever small like thing he would give him, that's when he was like, then like, you know what I mean? But so that's where he couldn't contain it anymore. So if you have balance in your life, then maybe you make better decisions. Though I don't know how that could have been better for him. I think he did the kind of best decision he could have in that situation with Walker. But at the same time, it was like a very harsh decision. And I think you're right. If he had a better balance in the rest of his life where he hadn't just let himself be walked on over and over again, and he had taken more an active role in having some sort of homeostasis between joy and misery, then he could have reacted maybe a little bit differently with Walker. And he also maybe wouldn't have been as fascinated with Catherine. I was trying, maybe you know U.S. history better than me. I have no clue, when did colleges become co-ed? Because my first assumption was when he was in university in 1919 when he started, that it was probably only other men were his classmates. And then all of a sudden, and they don't mention it, they don't say anything at all except for his two classmates who are masters in Finch. So you don't really know anything about it. And it isn't until at this point, when he's been teaching for quite a while and his daughter is almost grown, right? Like she's a young adult at this point. No, she's like, anyway, it's many years past then, where all of a sudden there are women in these classes. So I'm wondering where that inflection point was, just because I don't have a good history of it. Because I was wondering if he had met, this going back to him meeting Edith and his wife, like I had assumed he probably didn't have any female classmates. And so like him meeting her at the party was like an uncommon experience of meeting a girl, because he probably didn't have any relationship with them. But now I'm not sure.
I'd have to research it, but there's two things that are kind of popped into my mind. I don't think it was as uncommon as we think it is, especially at the time that Stoner would have been a student, because that's when colleges were, a couple things were happening. There was much more vocational education happening, and women were starting to enter sectors of the workforce that required that kind of training. So that would have been going on. Definitely throughout World War I, more women would have started to enter higher education. And I also think that the university he attends, it's Columbia. But it's in Missouri.
In Missouri, exactly,
So I think that would have been a much more liberal type of school. I think I'd have to Google it. That's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about that.
Yeah, I
But I
mean,
think,
it probably would have been the kind of knowledge that the original readers of this book or the original audience in the
yeah,
1960s would have known, right? They would have been very
yeah,
familiar with like when
yeah,
colleges became co-ed and these kind of things.
yeah,
Okay, so anyway,
yeah. That's
I think
interesting.
have finished the end. We've gotten to the end of where we've covered in the book so far. So
Mm,
we ended with chapter
yeah,
9. Um,
yeah,
so going forward, I know that you, uh, from my side, I said even if we weren't doing this buddy read, I'd be interested in going forward because as disappointed as I am with Stoner, he has a few
mm,
moments of like fighting for himself that I want to see if he can build on those or
mm,
not. I don't have a lot of
yeah,
faith he will, but I want to see what he does. And the writing
yeah,
itself is compelling to me. So those
yeah,
combined, like I'm invested enough in his character, like I want him to be
mm,
happy. So it's not like I
yeah,
don't care about it. I just am frustrated
yeah,
with him and I want him to be happy. So that means,
yeah,
William's done a job of investing me, right? So
mm,
I would continue reading, even if we weren't doing this buddy read. But I'm wondering,
mm.
what are you hoping for the back half of the book to be? Not like in terms of plot, but just like in terms of your experience reading it.
I'm hoping that it becomes more apparent what Williams is trying to express.
I see. Yeah.
Because I feel like up until now, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we're midway through the book. There's still lots of questions. Like, okay, so
Mhm.
why are we reading this book? What is the point of all of this? So particularly of this kind of character, that is just
Mhm.
sort of constantly buffeted by the forces of history and society. And like I said, we've kind of reached that point now where now he's finally taking a stand in the form of standing against Walker.
Mhm.
And, he's having people in his life like Lomax. He's had this weird marriage with Edith. He's got the relationship with the daughter. So I think there's enough now where it's like, yeah, I do want to finish it just to see kind of like, okay, where does all this go? And what's the point of it all? That's kind of
Yeah.
what I'm curious to see. So I'm
Yeah.
really kind of looking forward to that.
Yeah, I am too. I don't know if I expect there to be a point. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, maybe there is no point. Maybe that's the point.
I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean that in a bad way. But just that, like, I don't know if I expect there to be a point, but I am invested enough in his character that I want to see if he's able to claim any sort of like agency for himself in a
Mm,
long-term way. Um,
yep.
because you don't have to be an exceptional person to have a happy and fulfilled life, right? And
Mm,
right
yeah,
now,
yeah.
he only like him, as we know, like he's more or less forgotten. Like the students below him don't know his name, and his peers just don't want to end up like him, or something like that. Is what they say on the first
Yeah.
page after he dies.
Yeah.
That's fine. Like, you don't have to be,
Right.
the superstar to have a fulfilling
Yep.
life. And so that's kind of what
Yep.
I'm hoping is that he can find some balance and he can
Mm,
recover from the like passive way he's been living his life so far. Now that, as you said, there are like antagonistic like pivot points that are happening with these characters
mm,
of Lomax and Walker and Catherine. And
mm,
now that his daughter is no longer absent from his life, I know he wants to try to rebuild his relationship with her. So
mm.
I'm interested to see what he does going forward. So I'm
Yeah.
excited to keep going,
Yeah.
even if I don't know if there's going to be a point.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious to too, yeah, to see like what ends up happening with Walker, what ends up with Lomax.
Mhm.
Will Stoner just kind of quietly retreat again into his sort of world of academia, or will he, come into another phase of his life or something like that? So
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
quite
I
curious to see
agree.
about that. So,
Well, I agree, and I think maybe that's a good place for us to end it. Thank
mm.
you for having this conversation with me about it. It made the book
Oh
much
yeah, it
more
was great.
interesting. I
Yeah.
really enjoyed
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like I said, 50 minutes ago, I was ready to just stop reading this book, but after talking
well, there
about
you
it,
go.
now it's worth
Yeah, it's
reading. So,
interesting. I've definitely like
mm,
this book. I've been taking notes as I read it, which is not something
mm,
I haven't done that since college. But I wanted to make
mm.
sure that like my thoughts were put down before I came to this
Yep.
conversation, and that
Yep.
made me appreciate the book more. It also made me read it a lot slower because I have to stop and take
Mm.
notes.
Right.
But it made me think about it more, which I appreciated in this book, especially because there's not a
Mm.
lot of action happening. There's not a lot of plot. So like pausing
Yep.
in those moments that really jump out to me and then writing them
Mm.
down and then thinking about them has been useful. So I'm excited
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
continue this. And I
Yep.
look forward to our next one. So anyone that has stuck around watching this whole time, thank you so much for spending time with
Mm.
us. And
Mm.
I hope you can come back for I think we're gonna do a wrap up probably. Our next one will be when we finish the
Yep.
book, right? I think that's the
Yep.
plan.
That's right.
So
Yep.
I look forward to seeing you then. Bye.
Okay. Yeah. It'll be great.